What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my competitive tier list for the January 2021 format. Remember last time we did one of these, we just had the brand new December 2020 ban list, and the format was still premature. It was embryonic. We didn't know where it was going to go, but now that we've had some tournaments, we had an LCS, we had the Yu-Gi-Oh! Extravaganza, we have more empirical data to go off of, especially all the data over on YGeoScope as well, and that's going to help compile this tier list. So let's go ahead and head over to Tier Maker so you guys can see what we're looking at. We've got the tiers as always, tier 0, 1, 2, rogue, and everything else. The higher up on the list, that means it's seeing more representation, or it's just a stronger deck, usually somewhere in the middle, and we'll talk about that as we go through all the different decks. These are all the decks we're going to be talking about today here on the bottom. We could do an entire tier list of like every single archetype, but realistically that would take like an hour, so I just want to go ahead and give you guys a good sample of about 20 or so that are worth discussing. So let's go ahead and start off with, of course, Burning Abyss. I really want to put Burning Abyss like in Rogue because so many people are actually playing this deck at the moment. I think it's like the 10th or like 11th or 12th most deck played, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you look at it in the grand context of like how much people play a certain deck, that actually is a lot, but its win percentage is pretty bad. It's like in the low 40th percentile, and it's a really cool deck. It's got a lot of explosive capability and just the combo abilities there, but I just really am going to put this in everything else. Maybe the top of everything else. You're going to still run into this deck every once in a while, but it's just not really putting up the numbers to really justify it putting it anywhere higher. Next up is Virtual World. This is an easy tier 1. This is one of the strongest decks of the format. This was actually the front runner leading out of the December 2020 ban list. Who knew that a deck that could pump out true King of all calamities turn after turn after turn, sometimes in multiples, would be problematic, but obviously I'm kidding. The deck is just really strong. It's interesting because the deck does suffer from some consistency issues, but true King of all calamities is a format warping card, and all these other decks that you see here really have to adjust themselves to prepare for a deck like this, solely because true King of all calamities is just backbreaking against a majority of the meta. So this has been the case since Virtual World was released in Phantom Rage, and I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. If anything, it's actually going to get stronger in February with Blazing Vortex, because the deck will actually receive a new support card, which is an extender that will help it just be able to play through some more disruption. Next up is Infernoble. So this one's interesting. So Infernoble definitely suffered some hits on the most recent ban list. Smoke Grenade getting banned. We have Link Cross banned as well. And so Infernoble, you know, it doesn't see as much play as it once did. This was obviously a solid tier 1 contender back in the day, but I'm going to go ahead and put this at Rogue. Now, even though this is not putting up the numbers like it used to in terms of how many people are actually piloting the deck, I still think the deck is incredibly strong. The payoff may not necessarily be there like it was before, but a lot of people are still trying to figure out how to make this deck work. I've seen new combos of people just experimenting with some wild stuff. This is something to just not completely write off yet. I think maybe after another month or two, if the deck still really hasn't done a whole lot, we've got some more tournaments coming up in January, so maybe we'll see. But for now, I want to put this in Rogue because keep an eye on it. It definitely has some tricks up its sleeve. Altergeist is an interesting one. I'm actually going to put this at tier 2. So we're in a much slower format now. The format is more of a control-oriented format. You wouldn't guess when you have stuff like Virtual World, but Virtual World, even though it is like a combo deck trying to get to true King of all calamities, it's still very much inherently a control deck. And when you see when the rest of this tier list starts to fill out what the decks are towards the higher end of the tier list, it is more control-oriented. Also, with something like true King of all calamities in the meta, Altergeist doesn't really care too much because it's more of a trap-oriented deck, and so when you're able to play other trap cards that just help facilitate cards like Multi-Faker and the like, such as Torrential Tribute, you know, Ice Dragon's Prison, all these other just really big blowout trap cards, this is where a deck like Geist can actually thrive. We had a Dogmatica Altergeist deck actually get a top, I believe, at the LCS, and Altergeist has a very reasonable amount of representation right now. I think it actually has like a 56% win rate, and for being like the 6th or 7th most played deck online as it currently stands, I'm actually pretty impressed. I actually bumped this up to tier 2 because I think it's actually justified seeing it here just with the way the format is shaping up. Altergeist isn't too bad. Next up is ABC. This is going to everything else. Like Dragon Buster went to 3 on the ban list. That's cool. Is the deck doing anything? No, you might run into it in like the lower tiers of like Dueling Book or any of the online ranked simulators, but your ABC is just not doing anything. Next up is Guru. Now, Guru's a bit of an interesting one. Initially, I wanted to throw this in Rogue because it's a very similar deck to Altergeist in a lot of ways, but I actually think this deck is more reliant on monster effects than Altergeist is, and I think Altergeist is a better trap-oriented deck. Although Guru does play a lot of traps and is a good control deck, I think these two decks thrive in different formats, so I'm actually going to go ahead and throw this down into the everything else category. Again, the deck is still good, but I just don't think this is Guru's format, and while there are ways to kind of cheese wins with like Numeron and different things like that, I just really don't think this is Guru's time, but don't be surprised if you see this getting a top cut finish somewhere. Next up is Dragon Maid. So I am going to throw this into everything else, but I wanted to specifically put this in here for a few reasons. First of all, this did make a top 8 finish at, I believe, a PPG regional, but the real reason I wanted to discuss this is its impact in the OCG. The OCG's metagame is currently comprised of Virtual World as well as Eldritch, which we're going to be talking about next. When it comes to both of these decks, Dragon Maid actually plays against both of these decks very well and is actually one of their most represented decks because it kind of helps put these other decks in check. While our current TCG meta isn't really playing this deck to the same degree as the OCG is, again, completely separate formats, different ban lists, different card pools, I think this is something that you should keep on your radar for the future, because if the meta starts to go and pivot in that direction, Dragon Maid might be something that people start to pick up on. Remember, LP is still legal. All the broken Dragon Link cards are still legal for the most part, and so the Dragon Maid deck can actually take advantage of that. This deck can be quite scary, and again, depending on the way the meta goes, this might be something you want to keep your eye on. We mentioned Eldritch. This, in my eyes, is a solid tier 1. This deck has over a 60% win rate. There's so many different variants of Eldritch running around. I mean, you've got stuff like Pure Eldritch, you've got Invoked Eldritch. Those are like probably the lesser ones alongside Live Twin Eldritch as well, which is really cool that that's seeing play, but just really hasn't seen a ton of success. But if you're looking to more of the successful variants, we've got stuff such as Dragoon Eldritch. We also have like the 60 card amalgamation Eldritch list, which is just crazy. Eldritch is just so resilient. It also pairs very well against Virtual World because this deck doesn't really care too much about Calamity since a lot of its strong effects are in trap cards. And so if it's staring down to Calamities, it can easily just set a few cards and pass, deal with the Calamities on the following turn, and then it can just easily take over the game from there. The deck's grind game is insane, and so again, Zodiac Eldritch, Dogmatica Eldritch, I could go on. There's tons of different variants. Yes, some are better than others. If you're gonna pick the best of the best when it comes to the Eldritch variants, I would say Zodiac Eldritch is what you're looking at, maybe Dogmatica Eldritch, and of course Dragoon Eldritch as well. There's so many different directions you can take the deck, and because of the way Eldritch can check Virtual World, I think this is a solid tier 1 contender. Some people might want to put this down in tier 2, but this deck is just everywhere, and I think a deck that has over a 60% win rate and is seeing as much play as it is definitely deserves to be in tier 1. Next up is Adamancipator. This is going into everything else. I just wanted to talk about this primarily because we were talking about Eldritch, so I'm just taking a throwback to Secret Slayers. It's crazy to see this deck take such a fall from grace, but obviously when Block Dragon's banned, that is going to happen. It's just not a combo format, and yes, while some of these decks are inspired by combos, because obviously you look at Virtual World, you look at Drytron, there have been combo Eldritch variants in the past. You even have Infernoble Knight up here as well. They're just not able to thrive in this particular format. Again, when you look at a card like VFD, it's very difficult for like something like Adamancipator to play into that, and also some of the other cards we'll talk about a little bit later on. So it's just sitting here at everything else. You might run into it here and there, but nothing really to worry about. Next up is Dogmatica. I'm going to put this at tier 2. This is kind of representing all of the like Dogmatica variants. I would say if this is going to encapsulate just one particular deck, it would probably be Invoke Dogmatica, although I should have, I guess, maybe used Alistair the Invoker, but then you might think that's all the invoked variants. So I think Ecclesia representing Invoke Dogmatica in this case is more appropriate. The deck is still really strong. Invoke Dogmatica has a very solid win rate, I think like 57%. It isn't seeing nearly as much play as, say, Virtual World or Eldritch. I think it's like maybe tied with Altergeist. Geist might be outclassing it a little bit, but we've seen Invoke Dogmatica do some absolutely devastating things over the past couple of months, and it's just a pretty solid deck. It's a very traditional throwback to like more more old school Yu-Gi-Oh, very tempo oriented, and it's a very fair deck. It can do some unfair things, not as unfair as these decks in my eyes, but I think if you pick up Invoke Dogmatica, you're going to be feeling pretty good about it. Now, speaking of unfair things, here we have Drytron, and we are going to bump Virtual World out of the way for this one because I've got Drytron in the #1 spot in tier 1 because, man, this deck has just continued to impress me. When it comes to Drytron's ability to just pump out some really, really absurd turn 1 boards, Drytron is where it's at. But again, it's still very much a control-oriented deck, right? You know, you're playing cards like Herald of Ultimateness. You're playing stuff like Vanity's Ruler. You're playing stuff like Abyss Dweller. These are control-oriented cards. And so, yes, while the deck is able to just spam the field and help Link climb to some ridiculous degree, it's still playing a very control-oriented game. And a lot of the cards that you're going to play against Drytron also can fare very well against some of these other tier 1 decks as well. But in terms of representation, Drytron is taking up the most representation out of like every deck in the online environment. Obviously, it's going to vary depending on your particular meta, but in terms of win rate, it's at like 65%, I think even above that maybe. And so just by looking at the numbers, Drytron is just outperforming everything, and it's not even close. Again, Virtual World and Eldritch can definitely give Drytron a run for its money, but I think we're going to be sticking with Drytron in this tier 1 slot for probably the next few months until either we get Blazing Vortex or we also get a new ban list. Next up is going to be Mystic Mine. I'm just going to throw this down into everything else. So in the past, Mystic Mine has actually been this very interesting strategy against the combo decks, but I wanted to specifically have this on here to illustrate that Mystic Mine against control decks just does not work. When you look at decks like Virtual World that have the trap card, when you have Eldritch and their trap cards, these decks have inherent in-archetype outs to Mystic Mine, and so by that being the case, you're not able to just slam a Mystic Mine and just win the game. Yeah, sure, if you catch your opponent off guard and they're playing a deck that doesn't have an inherent out to the card, then it's fine, but most of the top decks based on pure representation and raw power have native outs, and that always typically happens in a control format, so Mystic Mine just isn't able to thrive. You might still see people side it maybe for some sort of combo matchup, and if anything, I think MBT's most recent Quarantine series illustrated that Mystic Mine is just not going to be able to keep up in this control-oriented format. Next up is Paleozoic, represented here by Totally Awesome. I'm just going to throw this into everything else. There have been some people playing Paleo, and it has popped up every once in a while, but representation-wise, power level-wise, it's just not doing it for me. Now, to be fair, the deck is still really cool, and also trap cards are seeing more play now than they probably have in like the last several years, but when you look at the way that these other decks are able to just take advantage of that, Paleozoic just really struggles, and while you may see it here and there, it's not nearly going to be the powerhouse that these other decks are at the top of the tier list. Now, next up is Salamangreat. Now, I'm actually going to throw Salamangreat in the Rogue tier. This may be a surprise to some of you, but when you look at the raw numbers in terms of win percentage and representation, Salamangreat has actually just shy of a 50% win rate, and it's like in the top 10 decks that are currently being played right now, and so I think that definitely counts for something. That means you're going to encounter this more often than maybe some of these other decks down here, and it's actually been able to go toe-to-toe with some of these top-tier contenders. Again, Salamangreat's this nice jack-of-all-trades deck. It doesn't really excel in any particular area, but having an out to just really everything just in your native deck, and then it's very splashable and adaptable depending on how the format shapes itself, and now that the format is starting to crystallize a little bit more, maybe Salamangreat's starting to adjust and figure out just what it needs to do in order to beat some of these top-tier decks. But I don't expect it to do too much, but I think it's pretty cool that when you just look at the numbers, the deck is actually faring rather well. Next up is Dragon Link. I'm going to throw this into Rogue as well. Now, the thing is, this is very similar to Infernoble Knight, where it's another deck that suffered some hits on the most recent December ban list, but I haven't lost hope for this deck yet. There are still people piloting the deck. The deck is still crazy. Like, the fact that LP is still legal, the fact that Dragoonity Knight Romulus, the fact that Pissy's still around, you know, Red MD, even with its errata, is still broken. There's so many payoffs for playing Dragon Link, and I think people just need time to figure out how to make the deck tick. If anything, once we get to the tournaments that are going to be at the end of this month, we are going to see, similar to Infernoble Knight, how well this deck is going to perform moving forward. Obviously, going up against stuff like True King of All Calamities, as well as, Vanity's Ruler in a deck like Drytron is a little bit difficult. You have to play some out-of-engine cards to be able to kind of deal with that, but at the same time, I still think there is some hope for this deck, and you're going to encounter this more than maybe stuff that you're going to see down in this everything else category. Next up is Chael. I've talked about this in the past, but I feel like anytime we're in a format where Eldritch is just the best deck or one of the best decks, it's almost impossible for Chael to be good. Now, we're still going to see Chael be played as like a little mini engine in like these Dogmatica decks because of Chael Schism. It's nice that your deck can just pump out a Winda if you need it, but I'm talking more about these like pure Chael lists. I just think it's difficult for these decks to really thrive. Winda's super good when you're in like a combo heavy format, and these decks don't really have outs to be able to stop that and combo off. Think similarly to Mystic Mine on that same line of thinking, but I have seen some players like Pack and others playing like a more control-y trap version of Chael, and I actually don't think that's too bad. If anything, like that might be able to bump it up to Rogue, but honestly, I just think that Chael, I mean, maybe I can just put it over here, because I still think the deck is better than some of these other options, but it's just going to stick at everything else for me. Next up is Sky Striker. I'm going to put Sky Striker in Rogue, as a matter of fact. When you look at the way the meta is shaping up, and this is going to be a lot of similar logic to Salamangreat, now that the format has started to solidify, we're starting to see Sky Striker poke its head out again, because now Sky Striker knows what it has to do in order to combat some of these higher tier decks. The spell reliance for Sky Striker is actually a boon in a lot of instances, and it is one of the strongest control decks we've ever had in the game, and even with Engage banned, thankfully, I still think the deck has an opportunity to shine. There's been a reasonable amount of people playing this deck, and similar to Salamangreat, it actually has a very reasonable amount of representation. Again, I believe it's in the top 10, maybe just slightly under, and its win rate is actually just under 50%, again, similarly to Salamangreat. So there's a lot of similarities here, and I think it just took some time for the format to really flesh itself out before these decks could rear their heads again, and so now that we're starting to see that, these decks are starting to re-enter the game. We'll see what happens, but I think it's interesting to see that progression and development as we move forward. Next up is Prank Kid. I'm throwing this into tier 2. Some people may disagree with this, but when you look at the raw numbers, this is like the 5th or 6th most played deck online as it currently stands. It has a win rate in like the mid 50 percentile, which is really good considering when you look at it compared to some of these other ones. The fact that it's holding a candle to that is incredible, and it's a pretty solid deck. Again, it does have its weaknesses, but I still think that over the course of these last few months that Prank Kids has still been able to compete. I was expecting this to fall off when I made this video, but when I looked at the numbers and I saw that it was still up there, I have to give it the respect and put it at tier 2. The deck can be absolutely crazy at times, and depending on the way the meta is shifting, the fact that people are focusing their attention on these 3 decks here, maybe this gives Prank Kids an opportunity to be able to compete. I'm not exactly sure. The deck can do so many things now thanks to the new Link 1 that it's something very devastating and something you need to look out for. So we're coming up on the end of the tier list here, and next up is Dinosaur. I'm going to go ahead and throw this in tier 2, but I'm going to put this at like the front of tier 2 because it's like just teetering on the edge of tier 1. Honestly, if I had a tier 1.5, I'd probably throw it there, but Dinosaur is just a house. I mean, it was one of the strongest decks for the past few months. The biggest issues with the deck have come in the form of Drytron and Virtual World. Virtual World has True King of All Calamities, Drytron has Vanity's Ruler, and Dinosaur just doesn't really have a lot of native ways to kind of deal with these cards. Yes, you can accommodate for that by just playing some other cards that can stop it, but at times, if Dinosaur is just staring down those cards dead in the face, it's going to be difficult for the deck to play. Dinosaur obviously thrives well against these sort of combo decks when it knows what it's doing, and so maybe now that the meta has started to solidify and Dinosaur is starting to get its footing again, maybe it'll start to excel once more. We saw in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Extravaganza that multiple of Dinosaurs were able to top, and again, compared to the tournaments prior to that, it didn't have the best conversion, but the deck is still nuts. Like, Miscellaneousaurus is still legal. All the cards are like still untouched for the most part. Dinosaur's not going anywhere. Expect to see this deck a lot. And then last but not least, we have Zoodiac. I'm going to throw this into tier 2. This kind of is going in tandem with Eldritch, but I guess if you're going to consider pure Zoodiac, again, it's a control format. Zoodiac's perfectly fine with that. And also, Zeus is just nuts. Any deck that can play Zeus, especially in a control format, like, you have to give that deck some level of respect. And the fact that Zoodiac can do it so easily thanks to a card like Borbo, yeah, you're going to still see a reasonable amount of Zoo. Tons of representation, a solid win rate. Do not expect Zoodiac to be going anywhere. anytime soon. Guys, that's going to wrap it up for my tier list for the competitive 2021 January format. Be sure to let me know down in the comments what you guys think. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and we will see you next time.